Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to Global Studies. I am Mr. Weeks. Alright, so we're going to get started with our introduction to Global Studies. But before we do that, let's talk about this setup here. So of course, you guys can see me down here lecturing at you. Up above me, you can see the note sheet that I gave you guys on Friday, or the note sheet that's also available on Schoology. Now, if you need directions on how to open that and modify it, please look at Friday's activity as I give you guys step-by-step directions to download PDF files, how to modify them, and turn them into Schoology. And over there, I've got the actual PowerPoint that I'll be giving this lecture from. Now, Global Studies is the study of the globe. This class could be taught either as an Earth Science class or a Social Studies class. I, being a social studies teacher, will be focusing on the social sciences aspect of this class. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me take you back in time. Let's think about that. What is social studies? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is, in fact, the study of society. I know, right? Okay, give me a moment here. So, social studies, the study of societies. Of course, the question is like, what is a society? It's a group of people, and it's however we want to look at that particular group of people. So, up on social studies, what is it? The study of society, and society is defined by a group of people that we are looking at. U.S. history will look at a group of people living in the area known as the United States from about colonization to now. Government will be the study of how people control themselves and others that live around them. Economics talks about how people tolerate the idea of unlimited wants, like we all want everything, but the limited resources available to us, how do we get those to match up? World history of the entire world, probably. Global studies is going to be about the study of both time and space. I'm sorry, that's as cool as I can make it sound. It's really not that cool. So what I mean by global studies is a study of time and space. Well, we'll see here that time is referring to all things that happened in the past, which is known as history. Sorry to make this boring. And space, not outer space, but rather the spatial area in which we live, Earth, the globe that we live on. So geography. This is a combination world history and geography class. So on your note sheet, you guys should have those things written down. Social studies is a study of society, a group of people, however we look at it. And global studies is a study of time and space. Luckily for you guys, you'll notice our note sheets are divided into a time section and a space section. So we kind of know when we're talking about history and when we're talking about geography. Now you'll notice I am like littered with all this stuff over here next to me. What is this? Well, this was the inspiration for the class. This class did not exist before I came to Newton High School. There was a geography class, there was a world history class, but I took over geography and world history was just kind of gone. So I figured, much like one of my favorite college textbooks that I read, Guns, Germs, and Steel, it really emphasizes the role that geography plays on the development of human civilizations. Now, it is kind of an oversimplified book, and there's a lot of things in it that scholars would debate as being totally accurate or not, but the sentiment still stands that a lot of different civilizations had different outcomes in life, and a lot of it seems to kind of be impacted by their geographical luck and where they lived. So that kind of gave me the idea to combine the classes here. Now, where all my stuff comes from, way over on the far side, you'll see a black book labeled The Big Eras. That is a book created by UCLA and other universities, I believe San Diego State, where they talked also about land and history and how they have a reciprocal relationship with one another. The homework assignments I use for this class for the most part are either A, created by me, as in I type them up, or they're created by the Stanford History Education Group. I like that their homework assignments a lot because they don't use big, dusty textbooks, but rather they look at experts in their fields, their research, and they also use primary sources from the time periods that we're studying. So if the topic we're looking at is ancient Egypt, it would be nice to look at things that were actually written and created from Egyptian times so we can see what historians look at when they make claims that they'll say in textbooks. So we're cutting out that textbook and we're looking at the original content and experts. Other things I'll try to use this year, I don't know if we'll be able to with this online learning, but another thing will be down there, Mankind, the Story of All of Us. It is a docu-series created by History Channel, one of their few decent programs that they still do from time to time. Phenomenal stuff. Also, I lean heavily on my schooling. I went to school at the University of Iowa, so I added that little graphic down there as well. So that is social studies, the study of people and all that we do. And this class, global studies, is the study of history and geography. Or, if you want to make it sound cool, time and space. All right, so into the history. Let's talk about what makes history. A lot of people kind of look at history and just think, oh, it's anything that's happened prior, like a second ago was history. And that was history. And that again was history, going all the way back infinitely to the dawn of time. Well, yes, technically that is history, but for the sake of this particular class, we're going to use a textbook definition, and we're actually going to shrink history a lot smaller than that. So for this, history. The events of the past, particularly those documented within a written language. If I were to shrink down my notes to just a little section, history, I would make sure I'd emphasize the presence of written language. That's right. Written language is going to be the one thing that separates history from prehistory. The second thing here is prehistory, or what's prehistoric. And that's basically any event that predates the presence of written language. That's the one that goes all way back. So the reason why I pick, and many scholars do as well, written language as being the defining factor between what's history and prehistoric just comes down to the idea of what is written language. It's not a bunch of nerds scribbling things down, but rather, in the simplest sense, it's like time travel. Someone wrote something down roughly 6,000 years ago. Could be something as simple as I'm trading a bushel of wheat for a goat. But that transaction, that exact thing that took place 6,000 years ago was documented, and when we read it, it takes us back to that moment. That exact moment happened 6,000 years ago, and because of written language, there's no debate over it. Now, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, we'll get into that later, but for the most part, early history, a lot of things that were documented weren't meant to be documented. They were just being written down. So it's pretty easy to tell that some farmer trading a bushel of wheat for a goat probably wasn't fabricated. So anything before that, prehistory, we kind of have to guess what's going on. Take, for if you will, way in the upper right-hand corner, those arrowheads. They're pretty easy to figure out. You and I, without having any background in archaeology, can kind of look at the pointy end and the other end with grooves that attach to a stick and assume, hey, pointy end must be used to kill things. Hey, look, there's a skull with an arrowhead embedded in it. Gee, I wonder how that person died. We're able to make educated guesses. And you know what? With 99.99% accuracy, we probably got that right. Now, unfortunately, there is a 0.01% that maybe those arrowheads weren't used for murdering. Maybe it was a ceremonial thing. Who knows? Maybe some sad pre-Neolithic person tied a bunch of arrowheads around his waist, danced for a lady caveman, and that was their mating ritual. Technically, I cannot say that that's, not possible, but I'm going to say that with probably more accuracy, it was in fact used for hunting, not a mating ritual. But being prehistoric, we're hypothesizing. Well, with written language, if we can translate it, we can actually read what's going on. Now, up here, we've got hieroglyphs. We can read that. Down there, we've got cuneiform. We can read that. Kind of angled here, comes from the Indus Valley. We can't read that. So even though that's written language, that's still technically prehistoric because we don't know exactly what it says. So recap. History, written language. Prehistoric, no written language. There is possible times that one part of the world was in history and the other was not. Like ancient Egypt had hieroglyphs roughly like 4,500 years ago, and actually probably even older than that. They would be in history because we can read that now thanks to the Rosetta Stone. Now over in Mexico, several thousand years ago, the Maya, having their Mayan script, yes, it's a written language, but we can't read it, so it means nothing to us, unfortunately. All right, next topic. We're going to look at generalization and bias. I love this topic because it's useful outside of history, not just historical things, as I'm sure you've heard generalization and most certainly bias, especially when talking about the news, a lot. So let's look at historical generalization. It is taking a complex and difficult issue/event and making it simple to understand by sacrificing the details. Basically, it's like you took a long story and then you just simplify it because of time. Kind of like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Ant-Man movies. Ant-Man has got a friend who just goes way too deep into stories. A historian would want to cut out a few of those things just to get to the point as soon as possible. The problem with generalization is sometimes people overgeneralize, they take too much out, and things are being omitted, whether unintentionally or on purpose, which could be far more detrimental. So examples, generalization. I, as a historian, generalize everything. I can't go into great detail of every little thing that happened because things are lost to history, and we just don't have time for that. So I try to generalize by taking out some unimportant things to the topic we're looking at. Now, let's say I were to stop a student from fighting another student in the hallway, and I pull them into two separate rooms. They might overgeneralize what happened because they don't want to say things that, put them at fault or to blame for the fight. Other things that might be examples of generalizations. I, as a historian, might talk about this dude. He was kind of a sad dude, tried to do a lot of things, and ultimately, at the end, he took his own life because he was unsuccessful when he tried. Kind of a sad story, right? But I'm overgeneralizing, like when in history was this? Where in history was it? What things did he try to accomplish? What more can you tell me? Okay, so this guy, I just overgeneralized, he tried to make his country stronger. They just suffered from a very defeating war. They owed a lot of money, and he wanted to make sure that he was able to make his country independent and strong once again. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. People disagreed with him, and he took his life. Oh, you want more details? Okay, so the year's like what? 1933, and we're in Germany. If you haven't figured it out now, just from those hints there, I'm talking about Adolf Hitler. So obviously, I can make the life sound better or worse, just depending on what things I am generalizing by adding in or leaving out. So generalization is when we take large, complex things and try to simplify it down for what we're trying to do. Bias, particularly historical bias. A single person's experience or point of view. In history, every retelling will have someone's bias. That's correct. Just like the news, when we're talking about history, there is always a bias. You cannot get away from it. By definition, it's a perspective. It's a point of view. So you can't get away from that. So historical generalization. We take complex things, shorten it by sacrificing details. Bias, it's purely one person's experience or point of view. This entire class is going to have the bias of what I choose to teach and not teach. That is my bias. If I look at a historical records of an old Greek dude by the name of Herodotus, and he tells about the Greco-Persian Wars, who do you think he might talk more favorably about? The Greeks, which he was a part of, or the Persians, their enemy? It's good to know bias when talking about historical perspective. I have a couple of examples over here. From the former president, Barack Obama. On the very far side, we see a negative bias towards the former president, where his Oval Office is clearly on fire, and he says, we don't have a spending problem. And most certainly, the office on fire is labeled spending. So the bias here is he is ignoring some glaringly bad issues going on with his presidency. The next one next to it actually depicts him in a positive bias. You can see him speaking kindly to a few children there, saying, "You see here, children, this is why you need a good education." And the guy next to him is holding up a sign, clearly yelling what the cartoonist wants you to think would be like conspiracy theories. Yelling things like, "No, kids, don't listen to him. He's indoctrinating your brains. Don't look him in the eyes. He's a socialist." Sorry to read it. It's very small print. So depending on your personal bias, you probably saw one of these cartoons and immediately thought one was more accurate than the other. That kind of lets you know what your personal bias is. So just to quickly recap, we've gone over history. That is the presence of written language. Prehistory, that is going to be the absence of written language, basically anything else. We talked about historical generalization, how people overgeneralize or leave out details. And lastly, historical bias, somebody's perspective on events that took place in history. Okay, some things we're going to talk about a lot in this class. That's going to be primary sources and secondary sources, or primary documents and secondary documents. This is important in history to know so we know where our information's coming from. So first things first, a primary source. A primary source is a first-hand account of an event. That's important to know because we're able to talk about like things that happened at that time. So way over on the side, I've got the Declaration of Independence. If I'm talking about the American Revolution, if I want to say exactly what people were feeling, I could read the Declaration word for word and be able to tell you, hey, this is what the people were feeling. This is what they signed on July 4th, 1776. That is a primary source because it's from the time. You know, I just now realized on the worksheet I haven't scrolled down yet. Look at that. All right. So primary source, first-hand accounts of the event. It's from the time. Secondary source. Now, these are interpretations of a primary source, typically seen in scholarly journals and articles, not from the time period. So way over, you see the Declaration of Independence. Right next to it, you see a blue book titled 1776. That author was not alive at the time of the Revolution. He is a very good scholar, wrote a lot of reputable historical books, and this one goes into a lot of detail. Now, granted, he was not there, but he's done a lot of research of primary sources and more than just the Declaration. So, a primary source is a first-hand account from the time period. A secondary source is not from that time, but rather later and typically researched or studied. Now, I always get the question, well, which one's better? Clearly, it's primary source because it's from the time period, right? And that all depends on what you are trying to do as a historian. If I want to find out the exact wording on the Declaration of Independence, yeah, I should go to the document and read it word for word. That is the best source for that. Now, maybe I want to know what's happening in 1773, events leading up to the American Revolution. The Declaration doesn't tell me any of that. It says nothing. So I actually would have to do other research. Although the author from 1776 did not live there, he did a lot of research and he talks about the events leading up to the independence. So here a secondary source would be more beneficial because it's telling me things that happened before. And in fact, the Declaration is just us declaring to the King of England that we believe he's a tyrant. He is not fulfilling his goal as being our leader. Therefore, we're forced to make our own leadership and leave them. Did it work? Obviously, we living now, yes, it did work, but there was still more fighting that went on. In fact, our country wasn't formed for several years later, but we wouldn't know that. We would think, oh, our country was born on 1776, July 4th. Well, technically, it actually came later because at that time, we're still fighting Britain to get them out of our country. Britain, very much so, still believes that this is their country at that time. So the book would give us more context as to what is going on. Now, the last one I'll almost never mention, but I just want to bring up, is a tertiary source. So we have primary, 1, secondary, 2, tertiary, 3. It is an index or textual consolidation of both secondary and primary sources, never citing an academic research, but rather a guide for help. This would be things like history textbooks that we have in class and Wikipedia. They're a good place to start for information, but you would never, in a scholarly debate, mention what you learned in your high school textbook or that you just looked at something in Wikipedia. You would want to look at a more reputable secondary or primary source to make that claim. Gotta check my time to see how I'm doing. All right. So, on your note sheet, that should actually conclude the history aspect of this class. So those are some historical terms you guys need to know for this class. What is history? What's prehistoric? When we look at history, we want to know what's the bias of these documents and are things being overgeneralized. Not all historians are really good at telling 100% of the story. In fact, a lot of times we don't know 100% of the story, so it's good to understand that that's not going to be an all-inclusive best document ever. We're also looking at primary and secondary sources. Another one that will come up basically in every homework assignment after this introductory unit. All right, so let's move on to the space aspect, geography. So what is geography, ladies and gentlemen? Now, don't write this all down. We'll shrink this up for you, but it states, it is the study of the physical features of the Earth and its atmosphere, and of human activity and its effects, and it is affected by these, including the distribution of population and resources, land use, and industries. Okay, that's a really long description for basically to say, we're studying how the land affects us people. Boom, that's it. How land affects us and we affect it. That's probably the easiest way to write that. So yes, technically the geography explanation is a lot more in depth. The study of the physical features of the Earth and its atmosphere and of human activities affects and affected by these. Okay, how Earth affects people, we affect it. That's going to be geography for a social studies perspective. Maybe not earth science, but social studies, yes. All right, so question, how are we going to use that in this class? Luckily for you, I've added down here our Iowa Core Standard. We'll be employing a lot of maps to display and explain the spatial patterns of human and environmental characteristics. I'm just putting that up now. That'll be a target later on in one of our classes, but just letting you know how geography is going to pop up. Because this class primarily is going to focus a lot more on history, we humans, being a social studies class, than the geography aspect, which is usually seen as more of a science thing, but we'll be looking at it from a social studies perspective in this class. All right, civilization and agriculture. Terms that'll come up a lot. So civilization, this will be a good one for us to know. Now, don't write this down yet. Wait till we can shrink it up a little bit. I probably should have said that at the start of the notes. Whoopsie. All right, civilization. People who live together with a similar background and culture. They live together because they have adopted an agrarian culture. So civilizations live together, similar background. That's it. People live together with a similar culture and background. And for this class, the first civilizations began because they started adopting an agrarian culture. Agrarian culture. That sounds so nerdy, but I know you've heard that phrase before. Agrarian culture often gets shrunk to agriculture. And that's our next word there. Agriculture, or an agrarian culture, is the growing of food to survive by domesticating plants and or animals. When people began farming more, we started seeing an agrarian revolution. Although it was a long process, took over a long period of time. The process was slow and it took a long time. So agrarian society or agrarian culture is basically the focus on farming plants and animals. Simple as that. Agriculture, focus on raising plants and animals, especially for human use. We can see way over on the side some art depicting some of the earliest agriculturalists from ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. In the middle, we see some Stone Age tools, tools made out of actual stone, and some bronze, coming later with the Bronze Age. And of course, some of the earliest crops that were ever cultivated would be things like wheat and other cereal grasses, because they're really easy to farm and they're protein rich. But we'll get more on that later. So last things here that we looked at, civilization. People live together with a similar background and culture. And agriculture is the focusing of surviving on farming plants and animals.